For David Coleman, moving into his new home in Riverside Estates felt like the culmination of years of hard work. After spending 15 years as a dedicated police officer, he had finally saved enough to buy the house of his dreams, a beautiful home in a quiet, upscale neighborhood in Atlanta. It was the kind of place he had always envisioned for himself, with a spacious backyard, a well-kept lawn, and most importantly, a stunning swimming pool where he could unwind after years of stress and long shifts on the force. David had sacrificed a lot to get to this point. Growing up in a modest household, he knew what it meant to work for every dollar. His career in law enforcement had been rewarding, but it had also been demanding long nights, dangerous situations, and the constant pressure of serving the community. Now, he was ready for a new chapter, one where he could relax and enjoy the peace and quiet he had earned. But peace wasn't something he would get not with Linda Whitaker as his neighbor. From the moment David moved in, Linda, a middle-aged white woman with an air of entitlement, made it clear that she saw him as an intruder in what she considered her neighborhood. At first, it was subtle, lingering stares, forced smiles, and condescending comments about how unexpected it was to see him move in. Then, it became more blatant. One afternoon, David walked out to his backyard, only to find Linda lounging by his pool, sipping a drink as if she owned the place. She looked up at him, completely unfazed, and said with a dismissive wave, "Oh, don't mind me. The last owners let me use the pool all the time. The new owner, and that this was private property." Lee doing him a favor by leaving. It didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, Linda continued to use his pool without permission, often bringing friends claiming she had unofficial neighborhood privileges, and what angered David the most was her tone, as if he. Then came, "My husband knows the chief of police." "Linda, you really don't want to make trouble for yourself, do you?" She smiled. She expected him to back down. But David Coleman wasn't. Instead of engaging in an argument, he installed high-quality security cameras, ensuring that dealing with someone like Linda required patience, strategy, and above all, proof. What she dire entitlement and blatant disregard for boundaries. Little did Linda know, David wasn't just going to win this fight, he was going to expose her for exactly who she was. After David Coleman made it clear to Linda Whitaker that she was not welcome to use his pool, he expected the issue to resolve itself. He had assumed that, like any reasonable person, she would respect his boundaries and move on. But Linda wasn't a reasonable person, and she certainly wasn't going to let go of her self-proclaimed neighborhood privileges without a fight. At first, her tactics were subtle. She would linger by the fence, peering over as if checking for an opportunity. Sometimes, David would catch her outside with a group of her friends, talking loudly about how things were changing in the neighborhood in a way that made it clear he was the change she didn't like. But soon, her behavior escalated into something far worse. One evening, after a long day, David returned home to find wet footprints leading from his pool to the back gate. His stomach tightened. Checking his Linda and a few of her friends had snuck into his yard while he was gone, laughing and drinking as if they had every right to be there. The audacity was infuriating. He had a plan. The next morning, David confronted her directly. "I saw the footage. You and your friends trespassed. This is my home, and it's time for you to start respecting that." But Linda only laughed. "Oh, lighten up, David. You're being so dramatic. It's just a pool. You weren't even using it." She waved him off, as if shimmer fav. "Besides, my husband's friends in law enforcement wouldn't appreciate you causing problems in the neighborhood." There it was, the thinly veiled threat, meant to remin. She expected him to be intimidated. She expected him to back down, but instead of escalating, David remained calm. He installed additional cameras, and every encounter, every time she tried to intimidate him, Every time she ignored his boundaries, he was going to outsmart her. Linda, however, didn't stop there. She began a campaign of harassment, doing whatever she could to make David disappearing from his Dorslost air overnight. Someone, and David knew exactly who had leaving trash near his fence, but the final straw came when his garden was destroyed. Overnight, someone weed killer over his well. It was a calculated act of spite, one meant to send a message. Linda wasn't. Linda wasn't going anywhere, and she wasn't done yet. But what Linda failed to realize was that David wasn't the kind of man who cowered under pressure. He wasn't just documenting her, he was preparing for the moment when he could expose her for exactly who she was. And that moment was Linda thought she had the upper hand. She had no idea that she was walking straight into a trap. It was a quiet Saturday morning when David Coleman heard the knock at his front door. He had been expecting it. Linda Whitaker had been pushing boundaries for weeks, trespassing, spreading lies, and sabotaging his property. He had seen this move coming from a mile away. When David opened the door, two uniformed officers stood on his porch. One of them, a younger officer, looked at David with the detached professionalism of someone responding to a routine call. But the other officer, Sergeant Mark Reynolds, immediately recognized him. "David?" Mark said, his brows lifting in surprise. David and Mark had once served together on the force, back when David was still in law enforcement. There had been mutual respect between them, and judging by the look on Mark's face, he wasn't expecting to find an old colleague at the center of a complaint. "Morning, Mark. What's this about?" David asked calmly, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. The younger officer cleared his throat. "We received a report about a suspicious individual using this property illegally. A neighbor called it in, claiming the real owners might not be aware of someone living here." David didn't need to ask who had called them. He could see Linda Whitaker watching from across the street, her arms folded, a self-satisfied smirk tugging at her lips. "You've got to be kidding me," David muttered under his breath. Sergeant Mark Reynolds exhaled sharply, already piecing together what had happened. He turned to his partner. "This is David Coleman. He owns this house. This complaint is garbage." The younger officer glanced at David, then at Linda, who was still standing on her porch, pretending to be deeply concerned about the situation. "You sure?" The caller sounded pretty convinced. Mark shot Linda a withering look before turning back to David. "Yeah, I'm sure. This man served on the force for 15 years. If he says this is his house, I believe him." Linda, clearly sensing that things weren't going her way, decided to play the victim card. She hurried over, her face twisted into a mask of feigned distress. "Officers, I was just looking out for the neighborhood. I didn't know how was I supposed to know he actually lived here. I just saw someone and got nervous." David let out a humorless chuckle. "Linda, you've been trespassing on my property for weeks. You knew exactly who lived here." The officers exchanged glances, and Mark turned to Linda with a tired expression. "Ma'am, making false police reports is a serious offense. If you continue to harass Mr. Coleman, there will be consequences." Linda's face turned red, but she knew better than to push her luck any further with the police watching. With a huff, she turned on her heel and stormed back to her house, muttering under her breath about how she was just trying to protect the community. Mark sighed, shaking his head. "She's not going to stop, is she?" David ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly. "No, but she's just given me even more proof of what she's doing. And trust me, I'll be using it." Because now, Linda wasn't just an entitled neighbor, she was a liability. And David was going to make sure that sooner or later she would face the consequences of her actions. After the failed attempt to have David Coleman removed from his own home by falsely reporting him to the police, Linda Whitaker didn't back down. If anything, her frustration seemed to fuel a new level of pettiness and hostility. She knew she couldn't go through law enforcement anymore, not after Sergeant Mark Reynolds had warned her about making false reports. So instead, she turned to more underhanded tactics, launching a silent but relentless campaign to make David's life miserable. It started with small inconveniences. Every morning, David would step outside to find that his newspaper had mysteriously disappeared. At first, he thought maybe it was just a delivery mistake. But after it happened for 2 weeks straight, he knew better. Then his trash bins kept getting knocked over during the night, spilling garbage all over his driveway. Again, at first, it seemed like an accident until he checked his security footage and saw Linda casually kicking them over while pretending to check her mailbox. Her actions grew bolder. One day, David found that someone had taken pictures of his house at night, leaving behind a series of blurry, unsettling images stuffed in his mailbox. Another time, he spotted Linda lingering near his property with a smug expression, watching as he picked up yet another pile of trash that had been dumped in his yard. But the worst offense came when David woke up one morning to find his garden destroyed. Someone had poured a heavy dose of weed killer onto his grass and flower beds, leaving large, ugly brown patches in what had once been a well-maintained lawn. The sight of it made David's jaw tighten, not because he cared so much about the grass, but because it was a blatant act of disrespect and malice. He knew exactly who had done it. But instead of confronting Linda directly, David did what he always did. He gathered proof. From the moment Linda's harassment escalated, David had been recording everything. His security cameras had captured her dumping trash, stealing his newspaper, and prowling near his yard late at night. He had documented each incident carefully, storing a folder full of timestamps, images, and video clips. Linda thought she was playing a game of intimidation. What she didn't realize was that David wasn't just tolerating her antics, he was building a case. What Linda also failed to see was that her behavior wasn't just affecting David anymore. Other neighbors had started noticing her erratic actions, and whispers spread through the community. People who once ignored the situation began to realize that Linda wasn't just a quirky neighbor, she was a problem. And soon, she would learn the hard way that actions have consequences. David knew he was close to ending this feud once and for all, but he needed one final move. And, as fate would have it, Linda was about to make the biggest mistake of all. After weeks of harassment, intimidation, and sabotage, David Coleman knew that Linda Whitaker's antics were far from over. But what she didn't realize was that she had already lost. David had played this carefully, gathering video evidence, documenting every incident, and making sure that when the moment was right, he would expose her for exactly who she was. That moment arrived sooner than he expected. The monthly neighborhood meeting was something David had originally avoided. It was usually just a group of long-time residents discussing minor concerns, parking violations, noise complaints, community events. But after everything that had happened, he knew that this meeting was the perfect place to reveal the truth. Linda, as expected, had her own agenda that night. She had been spreading rumors about David for weeks, painting him as a troublemaker, an outsider, someone who didn't fit in the neighborhood. That evening, she stood up and dramatically cleared her throat, addressing the room with fake concern laced in passive-aggressive hostility. "We need to talk about certain individuals who are negatively affecting our community," Linda announced, casting a pointed glance in David's direction. "Some of us have noticed changes in the neighborhood since new people moved in, and frankly, I'm concerned. Our property values are at stake. Our sense of safety is at stake. We can't just let certain behaviors go unchecked." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room, mostly from those who were either too intimidated by Linda to disagree or those who shared her outdated mindset. But before she could continue, David stood up, calm and collected. "That's a great point, Linda," he said smoothly, pulling a small remote from his pocket. "Let's talk about unacceptable behavior. In fact, I'd love to share something with the group." He pressed a button, and suddenly the projector screen at the front of the room lit up. The first video played grainy night footage of Linda creeping around David's property, dumping garbage near his fence. Gasps filled the room. Another clip showed her kicking over his trash bins, stealing his newspaper, and taking pictures of his house at night. The murmurs grew louder, shifting from confusion to outrage. But David wasn't done yet. He clicked again, and the next video showed Linda pouring a toxic substance over his well-kept garden, deliberately killing the grass and flowers. The final clip was her sneaking into his backyard and using his pool without permission, laughing with friends as if she owned the place. The room fell silent. Linda, who had been so smug just moments before, turned pale. She opened her mouth, probably to defend herself, but David spoke first. "You're right, Linda," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This neighborhood deserves better. That's why I wanted to make sure everyone sees what's really been happening. You've spent weeks trying to make me look like a bad neighbor, but the truth is, you've been trespassing, vandalizing, harassing, and outright lying to the police. And now everyone knows it." A few people shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had blindly believed Linda's lies. Others nodded in agreement, whispering about how inappropriate her behavior had been. But before anyone else could say a word, the Homeowners Association leader, a woman who had been neutral until this point, spoke up. "Linda, is this true?" she asked, crossing her arms. Linda stammered, her usual confidence crumbling. "I was just trying to protect the community. I thought..." "You thought what? That it was okay to break the law, to stalk and harass your neighbor, to destroy someone else's property?" Another resident interjected. For the first time, Linda realized she had no more allies left in the room. One by one, her supporters turned away, distancing themselves from her. The same people who had quietly agreed with her before now shook their heads, embarrassed to have ever believed her stories. And just like that, her power over the neighborhood evaporated. Linda stormed out of the meeting, but the damage was done. Her reputation was ruined. The people she once manipulated no longer feared her. The community had finally seen her for who she truly was. As David sat back down, his work complete, a few neighbors leaned over to shake his hand, muttering words of support and apologies for not speaking up sooner. For the first time since moving in, David felt something shift in the air. The house, the pool, the neighborhood, they finally felt like home. But Linda wasn't finished just yet, and David knew it. She still had one more mistake to make, and this time, karma was going to do the work for him. Despite being humiliated at the neighborhood meeting, Linda Whitaker wasn't ready to back down. David Coleman had publicly exposed her, stripping away the false reputation she had carefully crafted over the years. But instead of retreating, she doubled down, determined to get revenge in whatever petty way she could. Over the next few days, David noticed her watching him more than usual, her narrowed eyes following him as he mowed his lawn or sat by his pool, enjoying the peaceful backyard he had worked so hard to maintain. It was only a matter of time before she made another move, and David was more than ready for it. Sure enough, on a warm Saturday afternoon, David checked his security cameras and saw exactly what he had been expecting Linda, along with a few of her equally entitled friends, sneaking into his backyard once again. This time, she wasn't even trying to be discreet. She strutted through the gate like she owned the place, tossing her towel onto a lounge chair before slipping into the pool, laughing as if the events of the past few weeks had never happened. David watched from inside the house, shaking his head. She had learned nothing. What Linda didn't know was that David had been planning for this moment. After her last intrusion, David had done some research and found a perfectly legal but highly effective solution to deter trespassers: a special, non-toxic pool dye that only activated when it came into contact with certain chemicals found in high-end cosmetics, like expensive sunscreens and hair products. The dye was completely invisible in normal conditions, but the moment someone who had slathered on their overpriced SPF 50 or Salon brand hair conditioner jumped into the pool, it would turn the water and their skin a vibrant, unmistakable shade of green. And now it was showtime. As Linda and her friends swam, laughing and sipping their drinks, it took a few minutes before the first shriek echoed through the yard. "Oh my God, what's happening to my skin?" One of Linda's friends screamed, staring in horror at her arms, which had turned a bright, fluorescent green. Another woman gasped as she saw her reflection in her phone's camera, her once blonde hair now streaked with sickly emerald streaks. Linda, still floating lazily on an inflatable raft, was the last to notice until she saw the shocked faces of her friends. When she looked down at her hands, she let out a blood-curdling scream. "What the hell? What is this?" she shrieked, scrambling out of the pool as fast as she could. David, who had stepped outside just in time to witness the chaos, leaned against the back door, arms crossed, an amused smirk tugging at his lips. "Enjoying my pool, Linda?" he called out casually. Linda spun to face him, her face twisted with rage and panic. "You did this! This is illegal!" "I'll call the police," David chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, please do. I'd love to explain to them how you trespassed onto my property again and got exactly what you deserved." Linda's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again, but she had nothing to say. David continued, his voice calm but firm. "By the way, that dye, it's harmless, totally safe, but, it'll take about a week to fade. Hope you don't have any big social events coming up." The reality of the situation finally sank in. Linda and her friends, all now looking like characters out of a sci-fi movie, scrambled to grab their towels and bags, rushing toward the gate in utter humiliation. As she stormed away, Linda shot David a glare filled with pure hatred, but he simply smiled and waved. "Next time, just ask for permission, Linda." "Oh, wait, there won't be a next time." The incident spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, a video of Linda's Hulk transformation had already circulated among local residents, with many neighbors who had once feared speaking out against her now openly laughing behind her back. But for Linda, the consequences weren't just public embarrassment. She had already been on thin ice after the neighborhood meeting, and now, with the video evidence of her continued trespassing, the community officially turned against her. Within a week, Linda had put her house up for sale, and within a month, she was gone. For the first time since moving in, David finally felt at home. No more missing newspapers. No more vandalized gardens. No more entitled neighbors thinking they could do whatever they wanted. And best of all, the pool was his again, just as it always should have been. After the infamous pool incident, Linda Whitaker became the laughingstock of the entire neighborhood. What was supposed to be another entitled power play had completely backfired, leaving her and her friends humiliated. The bright green dye had done more than stain her skin. It had permanently stained her reputation. Within hours of the incident, a video taken by one of Linda's own friends had gone viral among the community. The footage of Linda's horrified reaction as she scrambled out of David Coleman's pool dripping green water and screaming about lawsuits, was replayed, shared, and laughed at by nearly everyone in the neighborhood. For years, Linda had cultivated an image of herself as an upstanding, influential resident, someone who dictated the social dynamics of the neighborhood, someone others should respect or fear. But now, she was nothing more than a punchline. Even those who had once sided with her began to distance themselves. Some out of embarrassment, others because they had never truly liked Linda but were too afraid to stand up to her before. Now, with undeniable proof of her actions circulating online and her true nature exposed, they had no reason to keep up the pretense. The fallout didn't stop at just the neighborhood. Linda's reputation in the broader community took a severe hit as well. As a real estate agent, she prided herself on presenting a polished and professional image, but no one wanted to buy a home from the woman who had been caught trespassing, harassing a neighbor, and throwing public tantrums. Her bosses at the agency were not amused. A formal complaint had already been filed against her by several residents, and now that the video of her trespassing and getting her green karma had gone public, the company had no choice but to take action. A week later, Linda was fired. Her company issued a statement distancing itself from her unprofessional and inappropriate conduct. And although she tried to downplay the situation, the damage was already done. Clients backed out of deals. Prospective buyers refused to work with her. The community no longer wanted her around. And then came the final blow. Linda was forced to put her house up for sale. For years, she had prided herself on being the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, the one who dictated what was and wasn't acceptable. Now, she was the one being pushed out. When the for sale sign appeared on her lawn, David Coleman couldn't help but smile. He hadn't needed to raise his voice or stoop to her level. All he had done was stand his ground, expose the truth, and let karma do the rest. Linda, of course, refused to go quietly. She tried one last, desperate attempt to control the narrative, claiming she was moving on to bigger and better things. But no one bought her story. Her reign was over. By the end of the month, she was gone, leaving behind a neighborhood that no longer had to walk on eggshells around her. For David, it wasn't just about winning. It was about reclaiming his peace. And for the first time since moving in, his home finally felt like home. With Linda Whitaker finally gone, the neighborhood of Riverside Estates felt different, lighter, freer, and more welcoming than ever before. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted, one that had loomed over the community for far too long. For David Coleman, the victory wasn't just about reclaiming his property, it was about restoring balance to a place that should have been a peaceful retreat from the world. The hostility, the paranoia, the silent fear that many of his neighbors once felt had disappeared. People who had once kept their heads down, avoiding confrontation, were now smiling, talking, and reconnecting in ways they never had before. One afternoon, as David sat by his now drama-free pool, he noticed something different. Neighbors who had once been distant were now gathering, forming friendships that had been impossible under Linda's rule. Families hosted weekend barbecues, children rode their bikes freely, and for the first time, the community felt like exactly that, a community. To David's surprise, people who had been hesitant to engage with him before now sought him out, expressing their gratitude for how he had handled the situation. "I should have spoken up sooner," one neighbor admitted, "but I didn't know how. Thank you for standing up to her." David simply nodded. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because it was the right thing to do. With Linda's departure, there was a newfound sense of unity among the residents. They realized that by allowing one person to control the narrative, they had inadvertently given her the power to dictate how they lived their lives. Now, with that power taken away, they could finally live freely, and David, he could finally enjoy the home he had worked so hard for, without fear of intrusion, harassment, or petty revenge. Looking around at the peaceful scene, David felt something he hadn't since moving in true contentment. His battle with Linda had been exhausting, but it had also proven something important. When you stand your ground, stay patient, and let the truth speak for itself, justice will always find its way. As the sun set over Riverside Estates, David leaned back, a satisfied smile on his face. His home was finally his, and this time, no one could take that away from him. With Linda Whitaker finally out of the neighborhood, Riverside Estates felt like a completely different place. The tension that had once hung over the community, the silent, unspoken fear of upsetting the self-proclaimed ruler of the block, had disappeared overnight. In her absence, life in the neighborhood flourished in a way it never had before. For David Coleman, the change was almost immediate. Gone were the passive-aggressive glances, the whispered conversations, and the feeling that he was constantly being watched. Instead, he noticed something remarkable. People were finally starting to talk to one another. Neighbors who had once been distant, wary of making enemies with Linda, now greeted each other with genuine warmth. Families who had previously kept to themselves out of fear of drawing Linda's scrutiny now gathered for weekend cookouts, their laughter filling the air. Children rode their bikes up and down the sidewalks freely, no longer restricted by Linda's absurd, self-imposed rules about who was allowed to play where. For the first time since moving in, David felt like he was part of a true community, one where people looked out for one another, rather than just for themselves. One evening, David was sitting by his now peaceful and drama-free pool, enjoying the sunset, when he heard a knock on his door. It was his next-door neighbor, a man named Greg, whom he had barely spoken to before. "Hey, David, we're having a little gathering this weekend. Figured you might want to stop by," Greg said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You know, now that certain people aren't around to ruin the fun." David chuckled, appreciating the invitation. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. These were people who, just weeks ago, had avoided him not out of dislike, but out of fear of Linda's backlash. Now, with her influence gone, they were finally free to be themselves again. And it wasn't just Greg. Over the next few weeks, David noticed more and more neighbors making an effort to include him, whether it was a friendly wave, a casual conversation at the mailbox, or an invitation to join a community event. The barriers that had once existed, not just between David and his neighbors, but between everyone, were breaking down. Even the neighborhood online group, once a battleground for Linda's toxic influence, had transformed into a genuine place for connection. Instead of seeing complaints and passive-aggressive comments, David saw posts about upcoming gatherings, recommendations for local businesses, and people offering to help each other out. It was the kind of community he had always hoped to live in, and now it was finally a reality. For David, the victory wasn't just about getting rid of Linda. It was about proving that standing up for yourself and doing the right thing can bring real change. He hadn't stooped to her level, hadn't retaliated with cruelty. Instead, he had let the truth speak for itself, and in the end, that was enough. Sitting back in his lounge chair, watching as his neighbors chatted and laughed just beyond the fence, David let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His home was finally his. His neighborhood was finally at peace. And for the first time since moving in, David Coleman could truly say that he belonged. The power of standing firm, a life lesson in strength and justice. As we age, we begin to see life through a different lens. We realize that some of the greatest battles we face are not always fought with force, but with patience, wisdom, and an unwavering sense of self-respect. We have all, at some point in our lives, encountered people who believe they can take advantage of others, people who manipulate, deceive, and try to exert control over the world around them. But what David Coleman's story teaches us is that standing firm in the face of adversity is sometimes the most powerful thing we can do. David worked hard to build a life for himself. He had served his community, saved his money, and earned his place in a peaceful neighborhood where he planned to enjoy his well-earned rest. But his peace was challenged not by misfortune, but by a person who refused to accept that she was no longer in control. Linda Whitaker was not just an annoying neighbor, she was a symbol of entitlement, of those who believe they are above the rules, above fairness, above consequences. When David stood his ground, she escalated. She tried intimidation, manipulation, and outright sabotage to drive him out. But instead of fighting fire with fire, David did something far more powerful. He stayed calm, he stayed patient, and he let the truth do the work for him. Lessons for life. Why standing firm matters. There are important lessons here, ones that many of us have learned the hard way over the years. Some people believe that if they push hard enough, others will fold. We have all known people like Linda, people who believe that if they make life difficult enough, they can control the situation. But bullies thrive on fear. The moment they realize they cannot intimidate someone, they begin to crumble. Integrity is stronger than manipulation. David did not retaliate with anger. He responded with strategy, with intelligence, with proof. He knew that truth is the most powerful weapon, and he allowed it to shine when the time was right. Community is everything. For years, Linda controlled the neighborhood through fear and influence. But when David exposed the truth, his neighbors found their voices. It is a reminder that when good people unite, no amount of manipulation can hold them back. Patience is power. Many of us have learned that the best way to defeat a toxic person is not by fighting them, but by letting them expose themselves. Linda thought she could keep pushing, but in the end, her own actions destroyed her. How this applies to all of us. As we grow older, we gain perspective. We understand that not every battle is won through confrontation sometimes. The most effective response is to stay the course and allow justice to reveal itself. We've seen this in our own lives, haven't we? Maybe it was a workplace bully who eventually lost their power. Maybe it was a dishonest neighbor who finally faced the consequences of their actions. Maybe it was a moment when you chose patience over anger, and that choice led to a better outcome than you could have imagined. The world often tells us that power belongs to the loudest, the most aggressive, the most forceful. But true power belongs to those who hold their ground, who refuse to let others push them out, and who trust that doing what is right will always lead to victory in the end. Passing this lesson on, for those of us in our later years, this story holds an even deeper meaning. We have the wisdom to share this truth with the younger generations, to remind them that strength is not just about standing tall, but about standing smart. And if this story has resonated with you, take a moment to like this video, share your own experiences in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, teach, and remind us of the values that truly matter. And if you know someone who needs this reminder today, share this video with them, because the world needs more people who know how to stand strong in the right way. Because in the end, the strongest person in the room is not the loudest, it is the one who refuses to be moved by injustice.